The flood came without warning in the spring of 1874, turning the Missouri River into a raging beast that swallowed everything in its path. And Zachary Holloway knew, as he urged his horse toward the submerged valley, that someone out there needed help more than they needed prayers. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, transforming St. Joe, Missouri into a waterlogged nightmare where the streets ran like rivers and the lowlands became lakes. Zachary had been checking on the outlying homesteads when he heard the scream cutting through the storm, a sound so desperate it made his blood run cold. He did not hesitate. He tied his horse to the highest ground he could find and started wading into the muddy water that churned with debris and the ghosts of what used to be farmland. The water rose quickly, from his knees to his waist, then up to his chest as he pushed forward against the current. The mud underneath sucked at his boots with every step, threatening to pull him under, but he kept moving toward where he had heard that cry. The rain pelted his face so hard he could barely see, but then he spotted her, a young woman clinging to what remained of a collapsed barn roof, her dark hair plastered to her face, her dress weighing her down like an anchor. "Hold on," Zachary shouted, his voice nearly lost in the roar of the water. She turned her head toward him, and even through the rain and mud, he could see the terror in her eyes. She was trapped, her leg caught beneath a beam that had pinned her against the wreckage. The water was rising faster now, already lapping at her chin as she struggled to keep her head above the surface. Zachary reached her and immediately assessed the situation. The beam was heavy, waterlogged oak that would take considerable strength to move. "I am going to lift this," he told her, his hands finding purchase on the slick wood. "When I do, you pull your leg free, understand?" "I cannot," she gasped, her lips trembling. "It hurts too much." "You can," he said firmly, meeting her gaze. "Because the alternative is drowning, and I did not wade through all this mud just to watch that happen." Something in his tone must have reached her because she nodded, her jaw setting with determination. Zachary braced himself, planted his feet as deep into the mud as he could manage, and heaved upward with everything he had. The beam shifted, rising just inches, but it was enough. The woman cried out in pain but pulled her leg free, and Zachary let the beam drop back into the churning water. Without wasting a second, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected despite her waterlogged clothing, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on as if he were the only solid thing left in the world. Maybe he was. The journey back was twice as hard. The water seemed to fight him with every step, the current trying to sweep his legs out from under him, the mud sucking at his boots with hungry insistence. The woman in his arms was shaking violently, whether from cold or shock or pain he could not tell, but she did not cry out again. She pressed her face against his shoulder and held on. His muscles screamed in protest. The water rose higher, nearly to his shoulders now, and he had to keep his arms raised to keep her head above the surface. His foot slipped on something hidden beneath the murky water, and for a heart-stopping moment, they both nearly went under, but he caught himself, adjusted his grip, and pushed forward. "What is your name?" he asked, partly to distract her and partly because he needed to hear a human voice that was not the howling wind. "Elena," she said against his shoulder, her voice barely audible. "Elena Bradford." "Zachary Holloway," he replied, taking another laborious step through the mud. "Though most folks just call me Zach." "Thank you, Zach," she whispered, and he felt something warm bloom in his chest despite the cold water trying to freeze him from the outside in. When they finally reached higher ground where his horse waited, Zachary's legs nearly gave out. He set Elena down carefully against a tree trunk, then immediately turned his attention to her injured leg. Her skirt was torn, and he could see the angry red marks where the beam had trapped her, already swelling and darkening with bruises. "Can you move your toes?" he asked. She tried, her face contorting with pain, but her toes moved inside her ruined boot. "Yes. Good. Probably not broken then, but we need to get you to Doc Brennan." He looked back at the flooded valley, at the destruction the river had wrought. "Where were you coming from? Is anyone else out there?" Elena shook her head, water dripping from her hair. "I was alone. I was riding out to the Whitmore farm to deliver some sewing work when the water came up so fast. My horse threw me when the barn collapsed." Zachary helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. She leaned back against his chest, and he wrapped one arm around her waist to keep her steady as they started the slow ride back towards St. Joe. The rain was finally beginning to ease, but the damage was done. The lowlands would be underwater for days, maybe weeks. As they rode, Elena began to shake again, harder this time. Zachary shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, even though it was soaked through. "Just a little further," he murmured. "Stay with me." "I am not going anywhere," she said. And despite everything, there was a hint of humor in her voice that made him smile. St. Joe was in chaos when they arrived. The main street had turned into a river itself, and people were working frantically to save what they could from the flooding. Zachary guided his horse straight to Doc Brennan's office, which sat on higher ground at the edge of town. He dismounted first, then lifted Elena down, carrying her inside despite her weak protests that she could walk. Doc Brennan was an older man with silver hair and steady hands that had seen every kind of injury and illness the frontier could throw at a person. He took one look at Elena and immediately cleared his examination table. "Set her down there, Zach. What happened?" While Zachary explained, the doctor cut away the remains of Elena's boot and examined her leg. She winced but did not cry out, biting her lower lip hard enough to draw blood. Zachary found himself reaching for her hand without thinking, and she gripped his fingers with surprising strength. "Nothing broken," Doc Brennan confirmed after a thorough examination. "But you have got some nasty bruising and swelling. You are going to need to stay off this leg for at least a week, young lady. And you," he turned to Zachary, "you look half drowned yourself. Get into some dry clothes before you catch your death." But Zachary did not leave. Not while they wrapped Elena's leg, not while they found her a dry dress from the doctor's wife's closet, not while they settled her into the small recovery room at the back of the office. He told himself it was because she had no one else, because he needed to make sure she was truly all right. But the truth was something deeper that he was not quite ready to name. When Elena was finally settled, propped up on pillows with her leg elevated, she looked at Zachary with those dark eyes that had haunted him since he first saw her clinging to that wreckage. "You saved my life," she said simply. "Anyone would have done the same," he replied, but they both knew that was not true. Plenty of men would have turned back when the water got that high, when the mud got that deep. But it was you who did it. She reached for his hand again, and this time when he took it, he did not let go. Over the next week, while Elena recovered and the floodwaters slowly receded, Zachary found reasons to visit Doc Brennan's office every day. He brought her books from the general store, flowers he picked from the hillsides that the flood had not touched, news about the town's recovery efforts. They talked for hours, and Zachary learned that Elena had come to St. Joe 6 months ago after her parents died, that she supported herself doing sewing and mending work, that she had a sharp wit and a laugh that sounded like music. Elena learned that Zachary worked a small ranch just outside of town, that he had been born in Missouri and never wanted to live anywhere else, that beneath his quiet exterior was a man who thought deeply about the world and his place in it. She learned that his hands, rough and calloused from years of hard work, could be impossibly gentle when they helped her move her injured leg or adjusted her pillows. On the 8th day, when Doc Brennan finally declared Elena well enough to walk with a cane, Zachary was there to escort her back to her small room above the dress shop where she worked. The town was still recovering, but the water had receded, leaving behind mud and destruction and the enormous task of rebuilding. "I do not know how I am going to repay you," Elena said as they stood outside her door. "You do not owe me anything," Zachary replied, but he was standing closer than strictly necessary, and he could not seem to make himself step away. "I do, though." She looked up at him, and there was something in her expression that made his heart hammer against his ribs. "You gave me my life back. That is not a small thing." "Elena," he started, then stopped, not sure what he wanted to say or how to say it. "How did you tell a woman you had known for barely a week that you could not imagine your days without her anymore? That the thought of riding back to your ranch and not seeing her tomorrow felt like losing something vital?" But Elena saved him from fumbling through it. She rose up on her toes, balancing carefully on her good leg, and kissed him. It was soft and sweet and over too quickly, but when she pulled back she was smiling. "That is for saving me," she said. Then she kissed him again, longer this time, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. When they parted, she whispered, "And that is because I wanted to." Zachary felt like he was drowning again, but in the best possible way. "Miss Bradford," he said, his voice rough, "I would very much like to call on you properly if you would permit it." "I thought you had been calling on me all week," she replied, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "I meant courting you, with flowers and dinners and the clear intention of winning your heart, if it is not too presumptuous to hope I might have a chance." Elena's smile softened into something tender. "Zachary Holloway, you already have my heart. You had it from the moment you waded into that water without hesitation. But yes, I would very much like you to court me properly anyway." The spring of 1874 gave way to summer, and as St. Joe rebuilt from the flood, Zachary and Elena built something too. He came to town every Sunday after church, and they would walk through the streets together, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. He brought her to his ranch, a modest spread with good grazing land and a sturdy house he had built himself, and she walked through it with shining eyes, commenting on the beautiful view from the kitchen window and how the bedroom upstairs would get lovely morning light. Elena introduced him to her world too, the small community of women who gathered at the dress shop to sew and gossip, the quiet evenings spent reading by lamplight, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with needle and thread. Zachary found himself sitting in her small room above the shop, watching her hands move with practiced precision, feeling more content than he had ever been in his life. They talked about everything. Elena told him about growing up in Illinois, about the fever that had taken both her parents within days of each other, about the loneliness of starting over in a new place with nothing but her sewing skills and her determination. Zachary told her about losing his own parents when he was young, about being raised by an uncle who taught him ranching and left him the land when he died, about the quiet satisfaction of working with his hands and building something lasting. "You ever get lonely out there?" Elena asked one evening as they sat on her small balcony, watching the sun set over the town. "I used to," Zachary admitted, "but not anymore, not since I met you." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was so lonely before the flood. Is that a terrible thing to say?" "That something so destructive brought me the best thing that has ever happened to me." "I do not think it is terrible," Zachary said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I think it means we found something good in the midst of something bad. That is not wrong. That is just life." By the time autumn painted the Missouri hills in gold and crimson, Everyone in St. Joe knew that Zachary Holloway and Elena Bradford were a matched set. They saw how his eyes followed her in church, how she lit up whenever he walked into a room, how they moved together with the kind of natural harmony that some couples spent years trying to find. On a crisp October morning, Zachary rode into town earlier than usual and went straight to the jewelry shop. He had been saving for months, ever since that first week when he realized that Elena was not just someone he cared about, but someone he could not imagine living without. The ring he chose was simple but beautiful, a single sapphire the color of a clear Missouri sky surrounded by tiny diamonds. That evening, he took Elena out to his ranch for dinner. She had been there many times before, had even helped him plant a kitchen garden and choose curtains for the windows, but tonight felt different. He had set the table with his mother's good china, the pieces he never used but had kept carefully packed away, and he had picked wildflowers for a centerpiece. "What is the occasion?" Elena asked, looking around with curious eyes. "Does a man need an occasion to want to make dinner special for the woman he loves?" Zachary replied, pulling out her chair. She sat, but she was watching him with that keen intelligence he had come to adore. "No, but you are nervous about something." "I can see it in the way you keep adjusting your collar," he laughed, caught. "You know me too well." "I should hope so after 6 months." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Whatever it is, just say it, Zach." So he did. He stood up, came around the table, and knelt down beside her chair. The words he had practiced flew out of his head the moment he looked into her eyes, so he spoke from his heart instead. "Elena, I went into that flood thinking I might die trying to save whoever was out there. But instead I found life. I found you. Every day since then has been better than the day before because you were in it. I want every day for the rest of my life to have you in it too. Will you marry me?" He pulled the ring from his pocket, and Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and then she was in his arms, laughing and crying at the same time, kissing him with a joy that made his heart feel too big for his chest. "I love you," she said against his lips. "I love you so much." "I love you too," he replied, and it was the truest thing he had ever said. They were married in November, in the same church where Zachary had been baptized as a baby. Elena wore a dress she had sewn herself, white silk with delicate embroidery along the hem and sleeves, and she looked so beautiful that Zachary felt his throat tighten when he saw her walking down the aisle. The whole town turned out for the wedding, all the people who had watched their courtship and approved, who were happy to see two good people find happiness together. Doc Brennan gave Elena away, and his wife cried through the entire ceremony. When Zachary slipped the wedding band onto Elena's finger, right above her engagement ring, his hands were shaking. When Elena said her vows, her voice was clear and strong and filled with a certainty that eased something deep in his soul. The kiss they shared as husband and wife was chaste enough for church, but held the promise of everything to come. As they walked back down the aisle together, Zachary caught Elena's eye and saw his own joy reflected there, multiplied and shining. The reception was held at the town hall, with food contributed by half the households in St. Joe, and music provided by anyone who could play an instrument. Zachary danced with his bride until his feet ached, and even then he did not want to stop. But eventually, as the moon rose high and the celebration showed no signs of slowing, they slipped away to begin their new life together. The ranch house had never felt like home until Elena walked through the door as his wife. Zachary carried her over the threshold, a tradition he had always thought silly, but now understood perfectly. He wanted to give her everything, do everything right, make her as happy as she made him. That first night as husband and wife, they lay together in the bed Zachary had built with his own hands, Elena curled against his side with her head on his chest. "I used to think I understood what it meant to be saved," she said quietly. "You pulled me out of that water, and I thought that was what being saved meant. But it is more than that, is it not? We saved each other." Zachary tightened his arms around her. "Yes," he agreed. "We did." Winter came, and with it the kind of cold that made staying close to the fire and each other not just pleasant but necessary. Elena transformed the ranch house into a true home, adding curtains and rugs and the small touches that made the space feel warm and lived in. She set up a sewing corner by the window where the light was best, and Zachary would often find her there, humming as she worked, looking so perfectly content that it made his chest ache. He taught her to ride better, to handle the horses and help with the cattle when needed. She taught him that there was more to life than work, that sometimes the most important thing you could do was sit together and talk or read aloud or simply be present with each other. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, the small irritations and the deep joys of sharing a life with another person. By the time spring returned to Missouri, bringing with it the memory of floods and rescue, Elena had news. She told Zachary one morning over breakfast, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat belly. "There is going to be 3 of us come autumn," she said, her eyes shining. Zachary felt like the breath had been knocked out of him. A baby. Their baby. He pulled Elena into his arms and held her close, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. A year ago, he had been alone, content with his solitary life because he had known nothing else. Now he had a wife he adored and a child on the way, and the world felt impossibly full of promise. "Are you happy?" Elena asked, pulling back to look at his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," he replied, then kissed her with all the love and wonder and joy he could not quite find words for. The pregnancy was not easy. Elena was sick most mornings for the first few months, and Zachary learned to make weak tea and dry toast, the only things she could keep down. He worried constantly, but Doc Brennan assured them that this was normal, that Elena was healthy and strong and the baby was growing just as it should. As her belly grew, Zachary found himself talking to it, telling their unborn child about the ranch, about Missouri, about the flood that had brought their parents together. Elena would laugh at him, running her fingers through his hair as he pressed his ear against her stomach, listening for any sign of movement. The baby kicked for the first time in July, while they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Elena gasped and grabbed Zachary's hand, pressing it against her belly. When he felt that small, strong flutter beneath his palm, he understood in a way he never had before what a miracle this was, this new life they had created together. They spent the summer preparing. Zachary built a cradle from oak, carving birds and flowers into the headboard. Elena sewed tiny clothes, blankets, and linens, each stitch placed with love. They argued good-naturedly about names, with Zachary favoring strong traditional names and Elena insisting on something with meaning behind it. The baby came in early September during a thunderstorm that reminded them both uncomfortably of the flood. Elena's labor started in the middle of the night, and Zachary rode through the rain to fetch Doc Brennan, his heart in his throat the entire time. The doctor came immediately, his wife with him, and together they helped Elena through the long hours of labor. Zachary stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping the sweat from her forehead, whispering encouragement and love even when she was too lost in pain to respond. When the baby finally came, crying lustily in the gray dawn light, Zachary felt tears streaming down his face. "It is a boy," Doc Brennan announced, placing the squirming bundle into Elena's arms. "A healthy, strong boy." Elena looked down at their son with wonder, then up at Zachary with exhausted joy. "Thomas," she said. "His name is Thomas, after your father." Zachary kissed her forehead, then touched one finger to their son's tiny hand. The baby gripped it immediately, and Zachary felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "Thomas Holloway," he said. "Welcome to the world, son." Those first weeks with a newborn were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Zachary learned to change diapers and swaddle and recognize the different cries that meant hungry or tired or just needing to be held. Elena, despite her own exhaustion, seemed to glow with a quiet contentment that made her even more beautiful than before. On quiet nights, when Thomas was finally sleeping and they could rest for a few hours, Zachary would hold Elena and marvel at how completely his life had changed in less than 2 years. From lonely rancher to husband and father, from wading through deadly floodwaters to wading through the beautiful chaos of family life. "Do you ever think about that day?" Elena asked one such night. "The flood?" "Every day," Zachary admitted. "How could I not? It gave me everything." She turned in his arms to look at him. "I was so scared when I saw that water rising. I thought I was going to die. And then I heard you calling out to hold on, and I thought maybe I had a chance. But even then, I had no idea. I could not have known that you were not just saving my life, but giving me a whole new one." "I felt it, though," Zachary said quietly. "Even in that moment, even when I was just trying to get us both to safety, I felt something shift. Like the whole world had been leading up to that moment, to finding you." Elena kissed him softly. "We found each other, and we are never letting go." The years that followed were good ones, filled with the hard work and simple joys of ranch life. Thomas grew from infant to toddler to little boy, learning to walk and talk and ride a horse almost before he could run. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's steady temperament, and he loved the ranch with the same passion Zachary did. When Thomas was 3, Elena told Zachary she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1878 they welcomed a daughter. They named her Caroline, and she had Elena's delicate features and Zachary's light hair, and she ruled the household with the fierce determination of someone who would never be held back by anything. The ranch prospered. Zachary expanded the herd, built a bigger barn, and improved the house with Elena's input until it was exactly what they both wanted. Elena kept up her sewing, teaching other women in town and eventually teaching Caroline when she was old enough. Thomas followed his father everywhere, learning ranching from the ground up, already talking about the day when it would be his. St. Joe grew too, recovering fully from the flood and then some. New families moved in, businesses opened, and the town that had been struggling before the disaster came back stronger and more vibrant. Zachary and Elena were part of that community, respected and valued, known for their kindness and their willingness to help neighbors in need. They never forgot that day in the flood, though. Every spring when the rains came and the Missouri River swelled, they would stand together and remember. Zachary would put his arm around Elena's waist, and she would lean into him, and they would be grateful for the danger that had passed and the life it had brought them. When Thomas was 8 and Caroline was 5, they took the children out to the place where the old barn had stood, where Elena had been trapped all those years ago. The land had recovered, green and lush, with no sign of the destruction that had once been there. "This is where I found your mother," Zachary told the children, who listened with wide eyes. They had heard the story before, but it never got old. "She was trapped, and the water was rising, and I had to wade through mud up to my chest to reach her." "Were you scared, Papa?" Caroline asked, holding tight to his hand. "Terrified," he admitted, "but I knew I had to save her. Because you loved her." Thomas asked with the logic of a child who was beginning to understand how the world worked. Zachary and Elena exchanged a glance. "I did not know her yet," Zachary said. "But maybe some part of me already did. Maybe some part of me knew that she was going to be the most important person in my life." Elena knelt down to her children's level. "The point is not just that your father saved me that day," she said. "The point is that he did not have to, but he chose to. He risked his own life for a stranger because it was the right thing to do. That is the kind of man he is, and that is the kind of people I hope you will both grow up to be. The kind who help when help is needed, no matter the cost." As the years passed and the children grew, Zachary and Elena grew older together with the kind of grace that came from deep love and mutual respect. There were hard times, of course. Winters when the cold was brutal and they lost cattle. Summers when the drought was so bad they worried about the wells running dry, sicknesses and injuries, and the normal struggles of life on the frontier. But through it all, they had each other. Every night, no matter how hard the day had been, they would lie together in their bed and talk or simply hold each other. Every morning, no matter how early Zachary had to rise for the ranch work, he would kiss Elena goodbye and tell her he loved her. These small rituals, repeated day after day and year after year, were the foundation of everything they built together. Thomas grew into a fine young man, strong and capable, with his father's work ethic and his mother's compassion. He courted a girl from town, the daughter of the blacksmith, and when he asked Zachary's advice about marriage, Zachary told him, "If you love her the way I love your mother, then you will have a good life together. It will not always be easy, but it will always be worth it." Caroline was fierce and independent, determined to see more of the world than just St. Joe. She had dreams of travel and adventure, and while it scared Elena to think of her daughter venturing so far, she understood. "Let her fly," Zachary said when they discussed it. "We raised her to be strong and capable. We have to trust that." But that was still in the future. For now, the family was together. The ranch was thriving, and Zachary and Elena were entering the comfortable middle years of their marriage where they knew each other so well that words were often unnecessary. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zachary took Elena back into town for a dinner at the hotel restaurant, just the two of them. It was a rare luxury to have time alone, and they savored it, talking and laughing like the young couple they had been, but with the depth of understanding that only came with time. 10 years, Elena said, looking at her husband across the table. "Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that you pulled me out of that water, and sometimes it feels like we have been together forever." "I know what you mean," Zachary replied. "I cannot really remember what my life was like before you, even though I lived that way for 25 years. "Do you have any regrets?" Elena asked, a question she had never posed before. Zachary did not hesitate. "Not a single one, you," she shook her head, her eyes bright. "Only that I wish I had met you sooner. Think of all the time we could have had together." "We have the time we have," Zachary said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "And I plan to make the most of every single day of it." They returned to the ranch that night under a sky full of stars, riding slowly, in no hurry to end the evening. When they reached home, the children were already asleep, watched over by Zachary's ranch hand and his wife who lived in the small cabin near the barn. Zachary and Elena stood on their porch for a long moment, looking out over the land they had built their life on. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that flood had never come?" Elena asked quietly. "If we had never met?" "I try not to," Zachary admitted. "Because thinking about a world where I do not have you in it is too painful, but I do think about how lucky I am. How easily it could have gone differently that day. If I had been on a different part of my property when I heard you scream, if the water had been just a little bit higher, if I had not been strong enough to carry you out." Elena turned to face him, cupping his cheek in her hand. "But you were strong enough. You did save me, and I thank God for it every single day. I thank Him for the flood that brought us together, for your courage, for everything that led to this life we have built." Zachary kissed her then, a kiss that held 10 years of love and partnership and shared joy and sorrow. When they finally pulled apart, they went inside together, hand in hand, ready for whatever the next 10 years and beyond would bring. As Thomas and Caroline grew older, the ranch became more of a family operation. Thomas took on more and more of the daily work, showing the kind of leadership and decision-making that made Zachary proud. Caroline helped her mother with the household and the sewing, but also surprised everyone by developing a talent for training horses. She had a way with the animals that was almost magical, able to gentle even the wildest Mustang with patience and kindness. The family expanded in other ways too. Thomas married his sweetheart in the summer of 1886, and they built a house on the far edge of the ranch property, close enough to be part of the operation, but far enough to have their own space. A year later, Zachary and Elena became grandparents when Thomas's wife gave birth to twin boys, and Zachary understood his own father's joy in a way he never had before. Caroline eventually left for a few years, traveling east to Philadelphia and New York, sending letters full of wonder and excitement about the things she was seeing and learning. But she came back, as Zachary had always known she would, bringing with her a husband she had met in St. Louis, a newspaperman who fell in love with both Caroline and the idea of frontier life. Through it all, Zachary and Elena remained the center around which everything else revolved. They were the ones the family came to for advice, for comfort, for celebration. Their love for each other was so evident, so steadfast, that it became the standard against which all other relationships were measured. On a spring day in 1889, 15 years after the flood that changed everything, Zachary and Elena rode out to their favorite spot on the ranch, a hill that overlooked the valley and gave a view all the way to St. Joe. They sat together in the grass, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "I have been thinking," Elena said, "about writing down our story, not for publication or anything like that, but for the grandchildren, so they know where they came from, how it all began." "That is a good idea," Zachary said, "though I am not sure my part of the story is all that interesting. Man wades through flood water, saves woman, they fall in love. It is pretty straightforward." Elena laughed, the sound as beautiful to him now as it had been 15 years ago. "You always did undersell yourself, but it is not just about the rescue, Zach. It is about everything that came after. The choice we made every single day to choose each other, to build this life together. That is the real story." "Then you should definitely write it down," Zachary said, pressing a kiss to her temple, "because it is a story worth remembering." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the day fade into evening. Zachary thought about all the moments that had led to this one, all the choices and chances and small miracles that had brought them together and kept them together. He thought about the young man he had been, wading through deadly floodwaters toward a woman he did not know, driven by nothing more than the conviction that someone needed help. He could not have imagined then what that single act would lead to, the entire life that would unfold from that one moment of courage. "I would do it all again," he said suddenly. "Every single bit of it exactly the way it happened." Elena lifted her head to look at him. "Even the scary parts? Even wading through mud up to your chest, not knowing if you would make it out alive? Especially that?" Zachary said firmly, because it brought me to you. And you are worth any amount of mud and fear and risk. You are worth everything. Tears shimmered in Elena's eyes, but she was smiling. I love you, Zachary Holloway. I have loved you since that first moment when I saw you coming through the water toward me like some kind of angel, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond. I love you too, Elena. Always have, always will. As the stars began to appear overhead, they rode back to the ranch together, to the home they had built, and the family they had raised, and the life they had created from nothing but love and determination. The house was bright with lamplight, warm and welcoming, and Zachary could hear the sounds of his grandchildren playing, Thomas's laugh, Caroline's voice. This was what he had saved all those years ago, he realized. Not just one woman trapped in rising water, but all of this. The entire beautiful, complicated, joyful web of life that had sprung from that single moment of connection. He had waded through mud up to his chest, found her trapped, and carried her to safety, never knowing that in saving her, he was also saving himself. They dismounted and walked hand in hand into the house, into the warmth and light and love that filled every corner. Thomas greeted them with news about the spring calves. Caroline wanted to show Elena a new embroidery pattern she had found, and the twins were begging Zachary to tell them a story before bed. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to sleep and the house was quiet, Zachary and Elena lay together in their bed, the same bed they had shared for 15 years. Elena had her head on his chest, and he was running his fingers through her hair, a gesture that had become so automatic he barely thought about it anymore. "Zach," Elena said softly, "are you happy?" It was a question she had asked him many times over the years, and his answer was always the same. "More than I ever thought possible," he said. "You, completely and utterly," she replied. "Though I do worry sometimes about what will happen when we get old, when the children have their own lives completely and it is just the two of us again." "Then it will be like it was in the beginning," Zachary said. "Just you and me figuring things out together, and that does not sound bad at all. In fact, it sounds pretty perfect." Elena snuggled closer. "You always know the right thing to say." "I've had a lot of practice," he teased, and she swatted his chest playfully. They drifted off to sleep like that, wrapped around each other, secure in the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. The flood had brought them together, but it was their choice, made every single day, that kept them that way. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. There were more grandchildren, more expansions to the ranch, more anniversaries and birthdays and quiet everyday moments that made up a life. Zachary's hair turned silver. Elena's face gained the lines that came from a lifetime of smiling, but the love between them never diminished. If anything, it deepened, becoming something so fundamental to who they were that neither could imagine existing without it. On their 25th anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Thomas and his wife, their 4 children, Caroline and her husband, their 2 daughters, all of them together in the house that Zachary had built and Elena had made into a home. There was food and music and laughter, and when Zachary and Elena danced together in the center of the room, everyone stopped to watch. They moved together with the ease of long practice, Zachary's hand firm at Elena's waist, her hand resting on his shoulder. Their eyes never left each other, and the love that flowed between them was so tangible that several of the women in the room felt tears spring to their eyes. 25 years, Elena said as they swayed to the music. A quarter of a century. Best 25 years of my life, Zachary replied. Though I am looking forward to the next 25 even more. Greedy, Elena teased, but her eyes were shining when the song ended, Thomas raised his glass in a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "who taught us all what love really means. Who showed us that the best things in life are worth fighting for, worth wading through floods for, worth every risk and sacrifice. May we all be lucky enough to find what they have found with each other." To Zachary and Elena, the room chorused, glasses raised high. That night, after all the guests had gone and the house was quiet once more, Zachary and Elena sat together on their porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cool evening air. The ranch spread out before them in the moonlight, peaceful and prosperous, a testament to decades of hard work and careful stewardship. "We built a good life," Elena said contentedly. "We did," Zachary agreed. "A really good life. And it all started with a flood and a rescue and a choice to help a stranger." Zachary pulled her closer. "Best choice I ever made. Well, that and asking you to marry me." "I think the two are tied for first place," Elena said with a laugh. They sat there until late into the night, talking about the past and the future, about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch and their plans for it. They talked about everything and nothing, the way they always had, the easy conversation of two people who knew each other completely and loved each other anyway. As Zachary finally led Elena inside and up to bed, he paused at the window in the hallway, the one that looked out over the ranch. He thought about that young man who had ridden out into a flood without hesitation, driven by nothing more than the knowledge that someone needed help. That man had no idea what he would find, no idea that his whole life was about to change in the best possible way. If he could go back and tell that younger version of himself anything, what would it be? Probably just to hold on tight once he found her, to never take a single moment for granted, to remember that the greatest adventure of his life was not wading through dangerous floodwaters, but the everyday adventure of building a life with the woman he loved. But that younger Zachary had figured it out on his own, had made all the right choices, had held on tight and never let go. And because of that, this older Zachary had everything he had ever wanted and so much more than he had ever dreamed possible. He turned away from the window and followed Elena into their room, into their bed, into the warm comfort of her arms. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, and the day after that, and the day after that. But they would face them all together, just as they had faced everything for the past 25 years. The flood had brought them together, but love had kept them that way. And that love would carry them through whatever years remained, a constant steady current more powerful than any flood, more enduring than any storm. They had waded through the darkness together and found light. They had been trapped and had freed each other. They had been saved and had done the saving in equal measure. And every morning when Zachary woke with Elena beside him, every evening when they sat together watching the sun set over their land, every moment in between, he was grateful. Grateful for the flood, grateful for the courage that had sent him wading through deadly water, grateful for the woman who had been waiting at the other end of that journey, and most of all, grateful for the choice they had made to build this beautiful life together. It was not always easy, but it was always worth it. And that, Zachary thought as sleep finally claimed him, was all that really mattered in the end. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic moments, but the steady accumulation of days spent with someone you loved, building something that would outlast you both. That was the real rescue, the real salvation, the real happily ever after. And they had found it together, in the mud and water and desperate hope of a Missouri flood so many years ago.